Okay, good morning, folks. Welcome to the Tuesday, September 15th, 2020 Working Group Component Standard Office Hours. This is our hour for folks to drop in, ask questions, and get help with what they are working on. I'm Mike Toffin, and I'll be in the channel today. Hey, Ameem, how are you?
Hello, Michael. What's up, man?
I'm good, dude.
Yeah, vacation's always good, right?
Yeah, getting ready for it. It's gonna be a good
All right.
time.
Yeah, like, uh, just was doing a follow up in the comments of the Gap to understand what
Okay,
are the ideas of the comments there.
sure. I can pull those up here if you want. One sec. I think like often what happens on these, there's all kinds of problems that need to be solved, right? And often what happens is you are solving a problem that's like adjacent to somebody else's problem. And then like, it's easy to like piggyback on that and be like, oh, like I also had this other idea of this other problem that I need solved. Maybe this could do that too. And so there's kind of a balance between um, saying like, okay, let me think about that and add that. And, that's really not what this is for yet. Let's stay focused on what the original problem we're trying to solve is, so that like we don't create a bunch of extra work that prevents us from solving that problem in the first place.
Totally understand.
Yeah, so that's, I like Movermere has some really interesting ideas around managing config maps in like more advanced bootstrap scenarios, but a lot of that is also like beyond what we're trying to do here, which is just like provide a file-based API. Hey, Lee.
But this config maps comes from the dynamic configuration.
He described a scenario where you would have like a component bootstrapping itself. So ADM kind of does this, um, and where there's a component that like creates a config map and then uses that config later. So it's like instead of just a consumer side workflow, it's a producer that's also a consumer.
Is that right to config function from scheduler and kubectl, I think? You can pass a parameter and then it dumps the configuration into a YAML.
So that is, I think that's more just to help people write their first config,
Okay.
like as a tool to generate your first config file. This is more like you actually like the component sort of self installs, and I think it's really a really hypothetical scenario.
Okay.
Like I was asking for examples and just getting like hypotheticals. Um, Although like I know kubeadm does create and manage like config maps for node config when it bootstraps, so that's probably like the closest real example we have.
Yeah, but this feature never needed to be built.
Okay, yeah,
Like
so
it did not need to be built this way. It does not need to continue working that way. And I've tried to express this several times on the Kubernetes call, but um, like Kubernetes has always like been touted, as having like very restricted like node local scope, and they added this cluster-wide configuration management API that's very incomplete. And like somebody just
okay.
needs to be able to pass their component config, like when the thing joins the cluster. That's all that needs to happen.
Okay, that's good context to have. Um, it would be good for us to maybe discuss this in a meeting that Lubomir can make it to, just to talk it through. Like I don't want to like um, rag on his proposal here um, without him here.
Well, yeah, and I'm missing some context on what you guys are talking about, but yeah.
But so yeah, we're a meme kindly rewrote the instance-specific config cap to support strategic merge patch approach instead of a case-by-case merge, which works much better. It's much easier to implement. It's much more flexible for users. So we're trying to like get that reviewed.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm just walking through some of the comments. So here, I can actually throw that up on the screen and you can see which desktop. This one. Can you see this?
Yes.
Cool. So this was one of the, I mean, he even said like some random thoughts. So it's not like he's requesting this. But the hypothetical is, and I really think this is derived from kubeadm. But the hypothetical is like you have some config map in a cluster or future config map. You install like the first instance of this component. It like writes its own config to that config map and then deprivileges itself before others are created. But I think like I think it's hypothetical, and I think there are better approaches to solving the same problem that more cleanly divide responsibility and don't require you to like screw with RBAC in the middle of your deployment. So like other approaches would be, and this is all out of scope for this cap at this point, in my opinion. So other approaches would be like using an operator to manage the install, give the operator the privilege to write the config, and only give the thing that is installed the privilege to read the config. You know,
Yeah,
like
I mean the config map that feeds the kubelet config, I believe it's stored in kubesystem. So
that one you can actually put anywhere.
you can put it anywhere, but in the kubeadm case,
Okay.
it's stored in kubesystem, and like so you would need to have significant privileges to ever modify that kubelet configuration.
Even reading that config is relatively privileged in that namespace.
Yeah, and I mean we chose to do it as a config map, but I mean if you have access to configs in kubesystem namespace, you probably have access to secrets, and that would give you.
You shouldn't. I mean, that's like that would be a pretty. If those are tied together in somebody's system, that's like a pretty.
Well, I'm just saying, like normally it's because you would have editor role
mistake.
or admin.
Okay, sure. Like if you're
Yeah.
if you're screwing around in kubesystem, like there's a good chance you're an admin.
So
sorry, I didn't know if we were talking about users or processes.
Yes, yeah. What I was getting at is if a user has that kind of permission in kubesystem, they likely have access to the service account tokens, which gives you the access to impersonate any privileged component in the cluster. So that's,
Okay, yeah. As far as like components privileges, I think like there's just like other ways to approach this problem, and without like an actual concrete example, it's just not.
Yeah, I don't really see
a pattern I'd recommend. But also like I don't it's just orthogonal to this proposal. Like we're just trying to provide a file-based API for components to like consume their configuration off the file system, and like anything beyond that is like there are problems that make sense for a working group but not for this specific cap.
Yeah, 1 second. I'm pulling up the KEP so that I can skim through what has changed.
Sure.
And I don't know if it's possible to succinctly explain what has changed.
I can just pull up the. So in the previous approach, we were adding a new kind called like kubelet instance config or foo instance config, and then we were going to write a case-by-case merge between layering the instance of the kind over the normal one.
Okay.
That is really, really difficult to implement. It sounds easy at the start because you're like, oh, I just like copy stuff between two structs. but when you layer all the API machinery in,
Mhm.
it's really hard, and it's really easy to clobber yourself, like
Mhm.
clobber state by accident. It's really easy because like automatic conversions can happen, and they'll clobber your perception of whether something was set or not by a user.
Yeah, I found
And all
a
kinds of
bug
yeah,
before I went to sleep this morning. That is exactly a problem with this kind of implementation between kubectl flags and kubeconfig and client config. So yeah, totally. It's like it sounds good in theory, and then you have the constraints of all of these Go structs, and it's
Yeah.
just not fun at all.
so
Cool. So I think
intuitive,
I'm understanding is
yeah.
yeah. So use strategic merge patch. Use the same kind. Basically
Yes,
allow
exactly.
this kind of hierarchical config to start appearing.
Yeah, and just to keep it simple, like you should only need 2 layers in the file system.
For most things, yeah.
Yeah, so it's just config, and there's still a config flag and an instance config flag. So it's really clear which one goes over the other. So it's like, if you're reading a command line, you don't have to like figure out what order like flags get layered
Okay.
in.
Yeah, that's fair.
And it's just all it does is strategic merge patch it. Like we can determine the best strategy for each field. Like kind of the only thing it maybe leaves to be desired is like, it would be nice if users could choose the strategy for the merge based on what they want. But I think that can be left to future work.
I see.
Like you might want to totally override this map. You might want to just interleave 2 maps. It's kind of ambiguous. Like we really can't figure that out as a service provider in all cases. I think we can make good. Like I think we can determine reasonable defaults.
Yeah, I mean,
But
for most things, like it would be, the use cases are kind of between you where you would, I guess, like if you want to interleave a map, like a good example of that would be runtime config for like the API server. I can't think of anything for kubelet. Maybe feature gates. Feature gates would be one, I think.
yeah.
Or if you, but the
So
strategic merge patch would interleave it by default.
you can,
It would not
yeah, you can
override it.
choose. You can choose, and I think interleave for almost every map is the correct answer.
Yeah, otherwise you should probably be using a list.
Because if you think of like, I mean, not Kubernetes, but like lots of other command line tools that have hierarchical configuration and only expose it via flags, like you're always like doing like -- something dot something else and like setting a specific parameter in
Yeah.
that structure. And so like the interleave approach would most closely match that convention.
Yeah, and then like if you need interleaving in a list, then you would match it by the merge key, right?
Yeah, it also minimizes duplication. Like if there's only one like sub parameter of a map that needs to be instance specific, like then that's the only one you have to specify in your instance config.
Yeah, such as a feature gate on a particular node group or something. So
yeah, I just noticed that pictures weren't showing up in here, and I don't know if that like a path needs to be changed or something.
well, I think that this is a great way to move forward on instance specific config.
Cool.
This makes sense. I can see a path for this working in KubeADM. One of the things that we have been doing in KubeADM is, this is why some of the way the feature was implemented was just very kind of like creeping in scope in areas and then incomplete in others, is you can supply a kubelet config, but only globally. Then when the node joins, it will copy the global kube config to the disk at that point in time. It doesn't stay synchronized. And then when the config is copied to the disk, you are lacking all the instance specific information about that inside that copy of the config. So it's not patched in any way. And the machinery was difficult enough, and they didn't want to import kubelet configuration into kubeadm to allow it to say like patch the instance specific fields. And
It wasn't even in the beginning. It wasn't
And
even
there's
like,
no-
you couldn't even do that without
Yeah.
rendering all of Kubernetes. It just like the repo wasn't set up to enable that.
yes, and the kubelet configuration API was missing the instance specific fields in general. So then
Right. Yeah. There's still only flags because it's waiting on this cap. Yeah.
Yeah, so the unit file then is used locally on the node to use flags via environment variables to then do the flag overrides at the kubelet for those fields. Now,
yeah, that's basically how everybody does it. Does Node Bootstrap is like, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Like
so point
I'm
being
always like-
is even if we didn't have the strategic merge patch, kubeadm was in a position where if it had the kubelet config API available or could use a hacky patch mechanism, it could have taken the global config from the cluster and extended upon it in a node specific way. Similarly, like we could have just had the user pass the kubelet config, for the node and like not have any global config storage. Like there was all kinds of things that could have happened that would be a more minimal idea than this kind of like half config management thing, half API. So I think that the approach that you two have iterated to here, I wholeheartedly agree with this. The kubelet configuration should have all of the fields. It's recommended not to set certain ones in the base configuration. The instance specific one can strategic merge patch to get those things, and tooling can generate those patches per node if necessary.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing as well is like you could like there's not really like a, when you're starting to talk about like operators generating these configs or like other kinds of compute patterns, there might be some interesting ways to I'm not really liking a lot of
I
this
think
idea.
that like this is really where like the value of like a simple but flexible approach comes through, and that it doesn't mandate any deployment pattern at a higher level.
Yeah, which I don't think is like a lot of kubeadm has built to encourage a lack of that. And the component config, the global config management piece being the only way to pass those configs has been a mistake that we've propagated across too many releases. We needed to start with the simpler thing. And honestly, I mean, I could have taken time to write the patches to fix this several releases ago, but yeah. But now we have this more complicated thing that users depend on, and it's locked into the API of kubeadm. Honestly, I think we should just deprecate it as fast as possible, or I have put in a couple of requests to do a design meeting about how it should work. If we decide to support the idea of node groups in kubeadm, then that's what would make the feature way more useful. Because right now you only have one node group, right? And then if kubeadm can come in and regardless of whether it's flags or now with this new strategic merge patch with the instance specific bit.
What's the current status of cluster API?
It doesn't really like compose as something inside of kubeadm, but it composes well around it. And if KubeADM supported doing per node kubelet configurations, then you could use CapK, the Cap PK, yeah, cab, whatever it is.
I don't know. Yeah.
Anyway, the infrastructure provider for KubeADM, or control plane provider for KubeADM.
Got
You
it.
can use that to supply kubelet config for a node group or a machine set, something like that is the name. Because you can treat the provisioning options like for that group of machines. So at the cluster API level, that's something that can be accomplished if KubeADM has support to just do the singleton configs, which right now it doesn't.
Got it. Okay.
You can
yeah.
hack around KubeADM's singleton config behavior if you use phases and then write to the file system as a user.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I believe Cluster API has some hacks that have experimented with that kind of approach, but I need to play with it more intimately to see.
I haven't really stayed up on it. It's just, I know they were like re-architecting the whole thing, and I kind of like lost track of it after that.
Yes, yeah, the V1 Alpha 3 API is much different than the previous renditions. And I can chase this down as well with the Weave workers who are participating in this process. But I don't typically attend the Cluster API meeting myself. But I join our sync calls every now and then on it to keep up to date with what things are. And then yeah, ideally KubeADM as a tool as well should first class support just like adding a node group label. It would be pretty simple, and then we would just change which config we load based off of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that doesn't sound like it's super complicated.
It's a logical extension of what's already there. If you can have multiple base configs, then people can accomplish what they need.
I think one thing I've realized with like infrastructure deployment patterns is that top-down patterns are just easier to implement than bottom-up patterns. And
so top-down by
basically like avoiding. So that I guess there's like two things. Like one thing is like avoiding cyclic dependencies helps a lot. So like these sort of like self-bootstrapping things, or like dynamic kubelet config even. It adds more directions to your data flow, and it just makes it like really hard to
reason about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, if you can have unidirectional flow, then that makes.
So that's where I'm,
And then when you think
I really like the idea of having like just like simple agents, like bootstrapping agents. So like, your today Kubernetes that still does a lot of it with shell and system to unit files, but like it's still, it's still like if you can get your config in and written to the file system the way you want, and then you get your thing bootstrapped, and then you just treat it as immutable. Like if you want to upgrade the node, you create a new node. Like it's much simpler. It's heavier weight because you end up having to tear things down and create new ones, and so it's like a little more expensive, but it's much simpler. I think you like save a lot in reliability. And
yeah,
like I also hope that like at some point like our software gets good enough that we like can do it cheaply and still be confident that it works. But for now, like the simplest patterns are like, your component just needs to read the config. Something else needs to write the config. Like whatever else needs to write the config, like just architect your system so it knows what to write.
Yeah, I think basically what you're getting at there is what I see as the value add of doing something like node groups in KubeADM. It's like there already is this top-down approach where KubeADM puts the component config at the global level, and then there is less coordination as the kubelets, the agents, are joining the cluster. Now they can be pointed to their configuration without having to have that data be supplied every single time.
Yeah.
Since it flows down from the control plane. And it's just a part of the privileged bootstrapping operation that lets it happen like that way.
Yeah, exactly. So like there's not, I guess what I mean around expensive is like it starts expensive. You can optimize that over time and make things more dynamic, but it's still architecturally easier to maintain like a top-down flow of most things.
Yeah.
And you can make exceptions for that in like key areas where it really matters. Like credential management, for example, is a great example where like it's much easier to centrally coordinate and like push keys down from a top level, but it's much more secure to have like hardware roots
localized,
local,
yeah,
and then use like those TPM attestations to sign keys that are created locally, so you're not sending keys over a network. So like there's occasionally cases like that where like you actually want it to be bottom up in certain cases instead of top down, but like I think in most cases like it's just easier to implement and verify top down approaches.
Yeah. So where this just was incompletely implemented in KubeADM is that the top down data flow is not indirectable anywhere. There's no way to branch based off of things that are very necessary in a Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah.
Like it's just not all worker nodes are the same.
And that's like
that's
a general problem of like it's hard to design good configuration management systems.
Yes, and so the easiest solution is to start with the simplest mechanism here, which is that instead of like pulling the node local config from somewhere, when somebody is operating on the node already, you allow them to, at a minimum, supply their config. And then the top-down data flow can still be the default experience if you decide to build it, right? But if you build it wrong, then your user has those escape hatches, and there's no cost in this case from a security or policy perspective in allowing that to happen. Because if somebody has access to bootstrap the node, they're running code on the node as a super user, and so they naturally have the permission to configure the kubelet the way that they want to.
Yeah.
And so it's like, don't make that, like, from a UX standpoint, impossible for somebody who does not understand the intricacies of what's happening, right? Like, provide an easy path for that user to do exactly what they need until the top-down experience that you have decided to own, this new configuration management that expands the scope of how KubeADM clusters are deployed, until that is good, right? Until it's serving the majority of people, until it's possible to do everything you need to do in that way. The -- config override, at the node local level at the time of bootstrap is the simpler mechanism that carries all of the cases and just lets the user do what they need to with the privilege that they already have.
Yeah. So anyway, I think we've gotten way beyond this cap at this point in this conversation.
The point being that I think that this cap is good.
Cool. If you wouldn't mind commenting on it with some of your thoughts on just like on the validity of the cap and your approval for that direction, that would be helpful in moving the discussion forward.
Yeah, I can do that right after this call.
Awesome.
Before my next thing. Cool. Has this been a good conversation for you, Amin? Do you have additional things you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, there's a good design class. how this thing should be designed. So Nice conversation.
Well, Mike really knows what he's doing. So.
Oh, thanks, Lee. I do my best, man. I'm not always right.
When are you married?
Sunday. So I'll be
On
off
Sunday.
for 2 weeks after that, and I'll also, starting this Thursday, I'm off. So
Nice, very nice.
Yeah.
So you've been taking some time before you decide to get married, or well, you've already decided to get married.
We've we've got a lot to do.
Tanya, my partner, her name is Tanya. She's been watching this Netflix reality show where like these people, they like meet each other without seeing each other, and then they decide to propose to each other without seeing each other, and then in a month they get like married.
This is like a COVID virtual relationship Netflix show thing.
It's called Love Is Blind, and it's it's kind of like sacrilegious, like what they do to marriage. It's kind of it's a sweet show, but then it's like also, and some of the people do end up getting married and sticking with it. They got like a solid thing, but like it's funny. They're at the altar, like in the ceremony.
Oh, it's like reality TV. Oh, this is.
They're like, will they say yes or no?
They like actually get married.
Yeah, it's like who says that at the altar, right? It's like if you show up at the altar, like you're saying yes, like don't like you got people's families there. Like
anyway, yeah, interesting. I don't do a lot of reality TV, but yeah, man, that stuff gets crazy sometimes.
It was an interesting tweak on. I guess it's like a exercise in thinking about how the world would work if you change things artificially.
Interesting.
I'm glad that that's not the system. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, we did the kept thing, and I'll comment on this with my full thoughts. Cool. Wow, there are 78 comments on this kept.
Yeah, it's been through several iterations. A
saga.
Yeah, it is quite a saga. When I first heard it, I thought like, oh, this will be merged in like a week because it's like pretty simple, right? I'm glad we had the discussion though, because that first approach was like ridiculously hard to actually do.
Yeah, I mean,
as a meme discovered after he offered to build a prototype.
This is the prototype.
Yeah, it's let's see.
But it looked very easy, for sure. But
yeah, if you look at the comments, you can
on this
you can see all the edge cases and like all the steps that it takes to actually like try and do this, maintain compatibility, like maintain whether things were set or unset, like make sure your results of the merge are consistent, like in all these different scenarios.
This is a huge issue that we've gotten ourselves into with Kubernetes API machinery, just the inability to understand whether or not a value is actually set.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
And
like we should have like implemented our own maybe type or just like used pointers for everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of this is adopted from gRPC, which has, for most of its history, not supported this kind of.
I'm pretty sure. So, like in Proto, I'm pretty sure there are. Yeah, I think you're right. Although I think there are, like, you can have optional fields and generate. The thing that's cool about Proto is it generates. You do everything through accessor methods. You don't read stuff off the struct directly. And you get accessors that have like conventions around like fields that may or may not be set that make it easier to work with.
But do you default values in the proto? Like, do you set default values in the proto description, or you set these in structures? Or
our defaults are just this. There's just a function that applies to defaults in Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
For Pro, like I haven't worked. It's funny. I work at Google, but I haven't like worked super closely with a ton of Proto stuff, so I don't actually know.
Yeah, there's some great rants by people on why proto is bad, and a lot of it is just like even where it came from, and I think it's after something's been so widely adopted, the damage is done, but then you get to a point where the protocol actually does get good. And
Yeah, like
that's
it's
kind of
like
where things are now.
yeah, and that's what I've kind of noticed about a lot of things. Like often software starts off super like it solves an interesting problem, it's useful, people use it, a lot of it's super ugly and doesn't work very well, but then like over time, like you can never get it to like as good as it would have been if you'd like nailed it in the first place, but you also never know like what you actually need to do in the first place, so it's kind of an impossible perfection to achieve.
It's
And at
certainly
the
a
end,
common
yeah, like
case. Yeah.
eventually it does get so good that it doesn't matter.
Yeah. But in this case, we have a legacy of APIs that have no distinction between whether or not a field is set when it would have cost 1 bit.
Yeah, this was what broke the first idea, the reality, the not
It
the lack of
breaks
capability.
so many things in
Yeah.
Kubernetes. Just everything that deals with API machinery, is so hard to deal with because of this lack of knowing whether or not something was intended to be set.
Yeah, and a lot of it just comes out of like, um, you know, Go doesn't have very like it has a native map, but it's not. It's just like not like it's a statically typed language, and it just like doesn't play nice with a lot of the like sort of ideas around like not only dynamic types but like dynamic manipulation of like heterogeneous containers and or
Yeah.
not necessarily manipulation. Well, yeah, so like in terms of merges manipulation, but also just like the idea that like you might get something and you don't actually know what's in it. And it's not like Go can't handle that. Like you have interface and you can do all these like casts and stuff. It's just like super verbose, and nobody wants to like deal with that code, so nobody writes that code. It's also
Yeah.
because of interface.
Yeah. It would have been interesting to see how we could have created structs or complementary structs
And we
that
have like a
allowed us
good
to
sorry.
do this kind of things.
Yeah, and we have like a good in between where like we know we like it's not like we just have like some random. It's not like downloading a web page. Like you're just gonna get some like random HTML. Like it might not even be formatted right, and like there's all this crazy stuff you have to do to like try and get that thing to render. It's like we have pretty well defined APIs with a like relatively small fixed set of options, and like I think we could have honestly like kept things as pointers in internal types so that we could maintain set versus unset behavior across conversions. Um, and like, and it gets weird with defaulting. It can get a little weird with defaulting.
It gets very, very weird with like multiple layers of option passing.
Because
any merging is super hard too. I'm pretty sure,
so
I need to go trace the code, but I'm pretty sure I hit a kubectl bug this morning that is exactly this bug.
So like one of the things is like not wanting to make it too complicated, right? Like if you could merge across API versions, like that would get really crazy because like, okay, like I got this, like what did the user actually mean? Like they didn't set these fields in this version and they want to merge it with this other version that like also doesn't set these fields. Like, do they want me to take the default from version A and like force that default into version B after the merge, or do they want me to like merge it and then default it like it's version B? Like there's all kinds of ambiguous situations like that you just can't resolve, and you just have to pick a convention and stick with it. But like, or you have to like force the complexity onto the user of like choosing what they want to do in all those cases, which like makes it a lot uglier. So it's like easier, like the reality is like probably nobody actually needs to merge across API versions for something like component config. And then if you need to merge across API versions, I like don't do defaulting on the first thing on the thing you're applying over the other thing. Like server-side apply, it's only a patch, right? It's not a like fully defaulted thing that gets applied over. And that's probably like the like two like simplifying characteristics that like make it tractable for people to work with.
Yeah, the conversions is definitely one of those things that's just not possible to preserve a good UX without. I mean, I feel like maybe we could write some additional field tracking based off of the raw map that's parsed via the YAML.
So that's what we do here. Like we just merge on the YAML. Like we require you to like your config and your instance config have to be the same API version and the same kind, and then we just merge the YAML and then we unmarshal it at the end, and it's just way simpler because like we basically like do it before it hits API machinery, and therefore we avoid all the problems that you get from trying to do it after it hits API machinery.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that like that wouldn't work in all cases, but in this case, it turns out it works actually really well and simplifies a lot.
No, it's basically what would happen like in KYAML with Kustomize.
Yeah, it is. It's
Kinds,
exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but the trade-off is that you need to keep the same version of both kinds.
Yeah, that's the trade-off. Exactly.
That's fine.
So
yes.
like if it works, actually it's probably interesting how Kustomize deals with that because it kind of sits in between. Like here we're managing resources that don't actually live in an API server. They're just config files. It's you don't have, and because you're following a top-down approach, it's very unlikely that you have version skewed clients writing the same configuration. Like if the like config Z endpoint or some other monitoring thing was available to monitor the configuration that was there, like you may have version skewed clients reading the configuration, but that's a different problem because you still have a single writer. And that kind of also gets you around the problem of trying to like write over old API versions. You might still have to do a conversion to get it to a version that the thing understands before you do a patch or like whatever. But probably that thing is just going to like be able to, if it's deploying like an old version of the component, it can use an old API version of the configuration. If it's deploying a new version, it can use a new API version. It's like not trying to patch the thing it just deployed in most scenarios. So like there's a lot of ways to simplify it. But with Kustomize, it's in an in-between where it is managing configuration that does live in an API. And it's likely that your configuration in your GitOps setup is going to lag in its understanding of available Kubernetes APIs versus what is available in the latest Kubernetes version that you just upgraded your cluster to. And I'm pretty sure like at the end of the customized flow, I think the way it handles this is like at the end of all the customized merge flows, like it does a server-side apply, and like the API server is storing in whatever the latest API version is, and it just like does the right conversions and
yeah, that would be the storage version
stuff at the end. So
via the
server-side
API
apply
server.
definitely has to handle merges like across versions.
I believe even the client-side apply just does the. Oh,
I think yeah.
I see what you're saying.
Client-side apply might as well. But I don't know the details. Like Daniel Smith is really the person to ask how it works.
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I never considered the fact that would happen.
Yeah, so it would have to.
I feel like
because you've upgraded your cluster, things are stored in the latest storage versions. If you've gone from like V1 to V2, V2 is the storage format in the API server, but all your GitOps config is still written in V1, and you're trying to apply that over V2. So it has to be able to do the merge across API versions. So server-side apply must have something that it's doing special to handle that case, whether it's converting, I don't know if it's converting the stored V2 to, the thing that's cool about the stored config is it's already all defaulted too. So it doesn't have the stored config doesn't actually need to know set versus unset.
I believe that the API machinery that's used to do this is not the same.
Okay.
So
yeah.
yeah.
What I assume happens is it takes the stored V2. This is one way it could work. It would maybe take the stored V2 and you're like trying to apply a V1 over it. It'll convert that V2 back to a V1 and do the apply and then convert it back to a V2.
I think it would go the other way. I think that the patch would.
You can't convert the patch though, unless you really, well,
I believe there's new API machinery
where that gets weird is if you have, there's a couple cases it gets weird. One, V2 might have fields that don't exist in V1, or vice versa. Usually the conversion mechanism is like to write a custom conversion and store those in annotations on one side or the other. That's one way it gets weird. The other way it gets weird is you might have a different representation of the same information in each API. Like something that was flat might be in a substructure. Something that was like a string in the older version might be a real structure in the newer version, and you have to do the conversion between those. And if you are, and so what gets really hard with those scenarios is mapping the understanding of set versus unset fields in one version to the understanding of set versus unset fields in the other version. You have like basically you have to write all these like functional maps. Let's say like you're basically writing like a bidirectional serializer between these two types for every field, and the complexity of doing that theoretically could be really significant.
And it would have to be done by a person in special cases,
like right? So it'd be much easier if you could convert what was stored into the format of the input, because then you don't need to maintain any of those mappings. Like you just use the set or unset of the input.
So the problem there though is just that it might be lossy.
As long as so for example, if you're applying a V1 over a V2, so you take your stored V2, convert it to a V1. Maybe your V2 had more fields, so like your V1 has some annotations that's storing those, but the V1 patch can't override those fields because it only has the old stuff, right? And then so you patch that over the V1. Like if there was a mapping from like some string in V1 to an actual structure in V2, like the conversion back to V2 takes care of that. So like you let your conversions handle those mappings.
I suppose if
don't do a conversion up front, so you don't lose.
Can do the field preservation, then you're fine.
Yeah. So I have no idea if that's actually how it works. Totally making stuff up to think about.
Do you know if this is supported? Like, I don't think it's even supported.
Server-side apply?
No, the version. I would assume that it is supported.
I think it has to be.
It has to be because
apply,
like the API version is going to be stored, or it's going to be available in the API server longer than it's going to be the storage version. So when we change the storage version in etcd for that API, then like anything that it gets applied as say v1 beta 1 is now going to be v1 like transparently converted, and then when it's read back, then how does the kind how does the API version get translated, Mike?
I think every time you upgrade it automatically converts every stored object to the latest API version of that.
So if I apply a v1 beta 1, then when I read it back with kubectl get, then I get a v1?
Your GET request can specify a version that you want in the response.
Right. Which would normally be the,
Yeah, with kube control, you probably get like it's probably more dynamic, but I don't know. Because if you have an old kube control, yeah, if you have an old kube control, you might just not print that new fields out.
Yeah.
I mean, in our case, like usually what happens with Kubernetes APIs is fields get added to existing API versions, and so if you have an old client, like you just don't see those fields. If you have, my phone is like so funny. It like my phone, when I get spam calls, it rings, but it doesn't turn the screen on, so there's just like this weird buzzing that happens. If you if you've made like an actual API version transition, I assume you still need a new client, but I also assume that the client is like requesting the version it understands when it makes the request.
Yeah, this happens with custom resources as well.
Yeah.
There's a slightly different code path that does a similar strategy with storage versions that is specified in the custom resource definition. And,
So this is very confusing. So what happens when you put an old version, like you try to apply an old version? It will break after you have.
As long as the API server supports the old version, then it gets transparently converted into the new version, and it's stored as the new version. And then on the next Kubernetes upgrade that eventually will deprecate the old version, your apply will start failing if you don't upgrade the objects.
Oh, because it will enter like in a deprecation phase, so you have time to change your side.
Yes.
But both will be available yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then even though you're using old objects, since the storage version was bumped,
When
then you can use the new fields. So.
When you use server-side, when you use apply in general, right? Like you get an annotation that says your last applied configuration. Does that annotation get, if you apply a v1 to a v2 and it works by, I mean, we don't actually know how it works, but maybe in theory it works by patching a v1 conversion of the v2 and then converting back. It also applies this annotation of the last applied configuration. Is that annotation converted, or is it kept in the original version? And I think that annotation is only like the subset of fields that got set. But server set apply adds some more stuff where it has like an actual like sort of field mask and that kind of thing, I think. So
yeah, it's like a higher resolution, like structured version of the last applied config JSON. But what is the canonical example that we can use here for probably something that not like deployment? That would be a bad example where we moved it from extensions, but something that stayed in the same API group.
Deployment is probably a good example. Like I would assume, or just like, actually I would guess that like lots of things, there's lots of controllers that are like throwing labels and annotations around on things that need to operate on the same resource, but on independent parts of that resource. There's like the other big use case of apply is like GitOps flows, right? Where I like change something and commit it to Git, and then that changed thing gets applied over whatever exists. And I might only be configuring a subset of that in Git, and like some other controller is managing the rest. Could be like an admission controller or something.
You're making me wonder if it's possible to use a Helm release to manage the same CRD, multiple of them.
Give it a shot.
Yeah, multiple Helm releases meant patching into the same CRD different versions. It would be append only though. No, maybe not.
I
Anyway,
don't know. I got to get rolling to another meeting here.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Anyway, I'll comment.
Good conversation, folks. Thank you. That was
Yeah.
fun.
Nice one. Yeah.
We might be completely wrong. We don't know.
Story of my life. So,
All right. Take care.
All right.
everyone.
See ya. Bye.